Hi, and welcome back to the Mob Mentality Show. I'm Chris Lucian, and my co-host is Austin Chadwick. And today we have Ted M. Young here with us to talk about a few interesting topics like traditional training versus learning ensembles, organizing code into testable hexagonal architecture, and doing TDD outside in, and refactoring in small steps. Ted, why don't you introduce yourself a little bit and we can get into our discussions.
Yeah, so I have been a software developer for decades. Always interested in, if nothing else, making my life easier. And so, sort of throughout my career, it's been about how to I think like a lot of developers, I'm a little lazy, and it's like, how can I do this better? How can I do this easier? How can I do this with less thinking? And so that's when I hit upon extreme programming back in 1989. Martin Fowler was going around speaking about it. I was like, ooh, this is for me. I like working with other people. I have a perfectionist streak, which causes procrastination when I'm doing stuff on my own. So I was always on the lookout for like, how can I work side by side with somebody, so that way I can be focused and disciplined. And then more recently, when I learned about ensembling, getting together, and it's like, oh wow, I can do that, and it's not as intense. So that's kind of awesome. So I've worked for a few companies you may have heard of, anywhere from eBay to Google to Apple to Guidewire Software. But I've always been sort of an entrepreneur kind of guy, and so now I'm back on my own with my own training and education company, focusing on making Java developers mostly just suffer less in their code bases and live in happier code bases.
All right. Well, that sounds good, and it's a good segue into traditional training versus learning ensembles. So, what were you thinking there? What are you experiencing?
Yeah, so when I was learning Java back in the mid 90s, right, pretty much when it came out, I sort of backed into training. I used to be really, like, talk about introvert. Like, I remember in school there were times when I would be almost mute and not talk. But you get me talking about something that I know about and am passionate about, and you can't shut me up. And so I was doing custom software development, had my own little company, as I said, entrepreneurial streak. And a friend of mine was doing C++ training, and he said, hey, I got a call for some Java training. This was 98, 97, 98. And I was like, and he says, do you want to help put this together? I'm like, okay, I know nothing about training, but I know at least, something. I can sort of stay the one chapter ahead of the other people. And it turned out I really liked it. And luckily also I was apparently good at it. So that was reassuring. And we built up a training company, and we were one of the first people to do Java training. But there was always something about it where it was lots of, I mean, you can imagine back in the 90s, especially, like very traditional, stand up in front of the room, do a bunch of lectures, do a bunch of demos. And this, talk about lack of technology. These were all done on transparencies. So I don't know if you've ever seen those, for those of you out there not old enough, but like it was basically a transparent sheet of plastic that you'd put on the thing that would project it through light onto a screen. And so that's what we did. We would print, and you could print on them. So we would carry around these 600 transparency things. And so clearly you couldn't like change stuff on the fly, and we were not doing much in the way of demos. But anyway, like there was something about it that felt very constraining. And I didn't know any better, right? It's not like I had any formal training in training. But it worked. People paid for it. A lot of travel. So I got burnt out on that, and then shifted to just doing software development. When I joined the most recent company I was working for, Apple, I joined because I wanted to do some more training again. And there was an opportunity to do that internally. And I missed it. And I was like, oh, I missed this so much. And the joy in seeing people like get that aha moment, like, oh, now I get it. Um, and learning from mistakes. So one of the things that stands out for me from doing some of that training, developing the training materials, is some of the best stuff came out of mistakes that I made. Like, oh crap, if we follow this direction, I put the direction in wrong and they get this exception. And it's like, oh wait, but now I can teach them about what this is, what this means, and how to get yourself out of it. Uh, and so then, due to other stuff, I basically left Apple because it was a certain kind of environment that just wasn't working for me anymore. Um, so I decided I wanted to focus more on teaching people, and because throughout the years and decades, I'd, as I mentioned in the intro, I'd been exposed to extreme programming and wanted to do it a lot, and so testing was important and refactoring was important, and I've been using tools like IntelliJ IDEA for 20 years, so I know it inside and out, and I feel like most people are using like 10% of it, and so I want them to use all this power, this awesome power, and they're using like just this little tiny bit. And when I went, independent and started doing training again, I wanted to learn more about how people learn. So I did what I kind of consider the equivalent of a master's degree in instructional design and figuring out how people learn. I actually have done some presentations on that at some conferences, and that really has informed sort of what how I do things. And so I've been, then COVID happened, and I was asked to do a course, and I basically, created it and delivered a bunch of times. And so where that leads into like how, especially remote, it's so hard to do training remote, because I'm used to when I did stand-up training, I'd be able to look at people and see reactions and see puzzled looks or sleepy looks or distracted looks or whatever. But the other thing that I missed when sort of went remote for training was being able to see their screen, like being able to walk around the room and casually, oh, look, how are you doing over there? Oh, that's interesting. And walk around and say, oh, what are you stuck on here? And let's talk about that. And you can kind of do it remotely, but it's really hard. The tools are just not there for that. And so I figured, well, that's just the way it's going to be. And then I started hearing about, remote ensembling. And I'm like, oh, yeah, of course, totally could do that. And played with different technologies and different ways of doing that. And I had been exposed to it at some conferences. I remember Llewellyn Falco was one of the ones who led me on to some of that and talked about what was the possibilities there. And started doing it for people who had been through some of my training classes, so that we could work on a code base that was not, let's start from scratch, but something that we had built throughout the course. And it was like, oh, this is the answer. This is because one of the things that we know from learning is we need to get feedback. Right? We learn not, we can learn by trial and error, but that's a horrible way to learn. Like a lot of us do it, I think, especially in this industry, because there's no cost to it. It's not like, I know people have woodworking hobbies. Well, trial and error, that can build up, expense and possibly hurt limbs. Whereas with, coding, it's like you're not producing anything for production. Or if you are, then your trial and error is a pretty big error. But when we're learning, the best way to learn is to get feedback from someone or something that can tell you you're on the right track or not. And we get those in the natural world. Like I remember when I'm teaching my son how to ride a bicycle, it's like, well, you just got to learn how to balance. But there's also then sort of progressions on how you do that. So the sort of the sequencing, but being able to really see where people, for me as a teacher, as a trainer, to see where people are going off and being able to then correct them, and then being able to use that information in the future saying, watch out for this. Although despite saying watch out for this, they will still run right into that problem. So learning, sometimes you have to hit the wall a little bit. And so now I've been switching, like I've been reducing the amount of sort of real-time live sort of traditional training. I still do it because that companies pay for that. That's how they work. That's how purchasing works. That's what they know how to buy. But over the past 6 to 9 months, I've been able to start slowly sell them on, look, the training is great, but it's 2 days, 4 days, whatever it is. You don't really learn a lot. You get exposed to a lot and stuff flies by and maybe you catch some of it. But the rest of it, like being able to then incorporate into your work, that is something that is, it really just has to be, water on a rock, just constantly trying and trying again. And so there's a couple of companies where I'm doing weekly ensembles with, a couple of groups. And it's just so awesome to see, like, the first few, everybody's sort of, what's this all about? Because they don't have experience with it. How do you work in this? The technical stuff of how do you switch? That usually gets, and just, whose job it is. And when I'm doing the learning ensembles, as opposed to a traditional ensemble where you're usually like one that we're actually creating work product, the learning ensemble is somewhat different. Like I have a much stricter way of, like, the navigator is the only one who can say anything. The driver is, fairly strict, strong pairing kind of thing. But I want the navigator to be the focus. Other people may know the answer, but I want the navigator to be the one who's learning. And so this sort of spotlight of learning on the navigator as we rotate out. It's like, yes, I know you know the answer over there, but I want her to answer this, because we learn also from the struggle, right? We have to think, and focus thinking on what's going on is really, it's like, oh, now I get it. Because if somebody else who knows jumps in, then that person didn't have a chance to think through the process. So that's where it's a little bit, the learning ensembles are a little bit different from the regular ensembles. And so now, like so I recently launched a course, a self-paced course on hexagonal architecture. And this has been like what I wanted to do for years, because it's like, look, there's some great stuff with lectures and videos and text. But the real learning is going to happen during these office hours where you have Q&A, but also learning ensembles where we'll actually apply some of these things. And that's really, what I want sort of my future to be.
Awesome.
Nice. Yeah. And I had some more questions about your learning ensembles, but maybe we'll get some definition of terms first. So you mentioned, I'm going to mispronounce it, hexagonal. Did I say it right?
Yes.
Do you mind giving a quick definition of that so people have
yeah, so
haven't heard of it before? Yeah.
So a lot of people know it as ports and adapters. So hexagonal so Alistair Coburn back in 2005 wrote up this pattern. He called it hexagonal architecture. He later called it then ports and adapters, because those are two of the key patterns. And some people still refer to it that way. I prefer hexagonal because ports and adapters is just like names of two patterns that happen to be part of this thing. But I think it's the overall way of organizing your code. And it's still, so we hopefully maybe have layers in our system that are well defined, although in my experience, they're not all that well defined. So hexagonal is basically a way of organizing your code, design the code, having clear separation between different parts. And it fits really well, although it doesn't require it, it fits really well with domain-driven design. So your domain is at the center. And so it really focuses, instead of having sort of a vertical stack, it refocuses the domain in the center. This is it. And then everything else in terms of interacting with the outside world, obviously you need it, because otherwise it's just sitting there running in memory with nobody looking at it. But that's somewhat secondary to the focus on the business. And for me, I came to it because I was trying to make code more testable. Like I have this, I always say, how can we make this code more testable? And I noticed when I was really pushing on that, it's like, wait a minute, this looks like this other thing. And over time, it's like, oh, this makes it so much easier to test by making it clear the stuff inside of the hexagon has no reference to anything concrete in the real world. No IO, no hardware, no nothing. And so therefore it's trivially unit testable. And then the hard part is then integrating it, but also the hard part is getting that stuff right. And I see this over and over again with code bases, is when IO of any sort gets mixed up with domain stuff, it just makes it so much harder to test. So there's other architectures, clean architecture, onion architecture, that are mostly the same, but I go with hexagonal because there's some specific details around the things sort of that connect with the outside that are separate from one another, that makes code organization better.
Nice, nice. Cool. Yeah, so one follow-up question I had, kind of, it's maybe a learning ensemble with hexagonal architecture, is how do you translate or help people want to learn in an ensemble? Because like you were saying before, the problem was companies are used to buying lecture, solo lab style things, right? Or whatever. And it's usually a large amount of people. What I remember from a lot of my corporate training, especially in previous careers, is that, you know, the whole incentive structure is to get as many people in the classroom as possible, and which just takes away, you know, the ratio from teacher to student as just gets bigger and bigger, right? Yeah, how do you handle those kind of influences in the culture and lead someone into an ensemble style learning?
So I was mostly getting, the companies I've been able to sort of sell the ensembles to is where I've had basically a strong internal person who was pushing for it.
Okay.
And they were pushing for it because they experienced it, because they had taken one of my public courses that, you know, basically public, where you don't have to be a company, you're just an individual signing up. And the learning ensembles I basically did for free, mainly because like I want to learn too. And like that's one of the other things that I didn't mention, is like training. After you've done a training class, like my hexagonal architecture class, I've taught 40 times. I'm like, I know exactly how this goes. Like I keep I don't know if anybody else does this, but I keep very precise when I'm doing the regular training, of timing, of like, here's where I started this section, here's where I started this section, here's where I started the lab, here's where we took a break. And I look back and I compare, and it's like, sometimes it's a little scary how accurate to the minute it is between the, you know, another time. You'd expect like it would change, and sometimes it does, but like after, you know, 30, 40 times, I'm like, I'm not learning anything anymore. And for me, one of the things I love about training is not just sharing my knowledge, but I'm also experiencing their learning, and sort of seeing different things, and me being challenged and learning as well. Although occasionally somebody will come up with something and ask a question, I'm like, wow, where did that come from? Why didn't I think of that 39 sessions ago? Like this happened actually very recently, and I was like, oh wow, actually that's really interesting. But that you sort of, if you graph the number of times that kind of thing happened over time in my training, is going like that. Whereas ensembles, I am learning just along with everybody else. And because we're exploring things, we're seeing, you know, we're building the code base. Like we're continually building it. You know, people swap in and out like any, you know, sort of ensemble. And I'm learning as well. And I'm like, you know, for me, this is it just feeds into all the other stuff that I do. And so it's, you know, for all those reasons, it's better for them and it's better for me. And so the ones that I do for some of the people, then they say, hey, they see a difference in the way they work. They see how effective the ensembles is. Like, wow, over the past 6 months, year, I really see a change in the way I work. And then they tell their company saying, look, we could hire for just the training, but really the real, you know, really learning it is happening in the ensembles. And so that's how I've been able to convince some people, just by giving them that experience. And I always think about G-Paw Hill. You always says like, you know, give people the experience, and that's what you want. Don't try to debate or argue. Just give them that experience. Let them feel it. And for some things, it takes a little bit of time. So I'm happy to like do this for free because I'm learning, but also because I want them to experience it. And if it happens to sell something, that's great. But that was never the primary mechanism. But it turns out that really worked.
In the traditional training versus the learning ensembles, is there like a good segue that you do from one to the other? In your traditional training right now, do you also do some ensembling, or is it just like, are they like completely separate, or how did you separate that out? Is that something else that the company needs to ask for, that sort of thing?
Yeah, so what I do is I basically tell the company, look, we'll do the regular training because I think if we're going to do things that require knowledge, they have to have that knowledge.
Mhm.
And you can sort of drip it in the ensembles, but I think there is a place for sort of, look, we're going to do a bit more of a traditional training to I'm going to dump a bunch of information. You'll get a little bit percentage of it, but at least you'll be exposed to it so that when I mention it, it'll be like, oh yeah, I remember that. You may not remember exactly what it is. So what I found that works pretty well is do the traditional training and then go right into weekly ensembles that then builds on that. And because my training is project based, we basically start from where the project ended at the end of the class and continue developing on that, going off in all sorts of different directions that's based on what the people want. For my self-paced course, it's it'll be interesting because the learning ensembles that I'm going to be doing are while the course is happening. And so I'm going to have to adjust things where I can't rely on, we've already got this project built and we can build on it. So we'll probably do more things around just getting people used to things. So we'll do some katas, using some of the techniques that they've learned in that week's class. And then eventually they'll have built up enough knowledge that we can start then building more sophisticated things. Because I'm very much a believer in, you got to work on realistic code. Whether you're learning or whatever learning you're doing, it has to be realistic. And this is the kind of thing that drives me crazy when I see just the most trivial kinds of boring and boring from a sense of there's nothing interesting here. And there's nothing that, or it's these little things that you build and then you throw away. It's like, I want to work on bigger things that have more interesting things, especially from a testing standpoint, that it's involving external services and databases and things like that.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I know what you're saying with you can teach an ensemble. I teach on, like, we're working on production code ensemble, and a lot of people teach me in those ensembles, and that can work really well, especially if the group is really small, on the smaller side, right? And but it does help a lot if a lot of knowledge is, at least familiarity is
Right.
established beforehand. And so
Yeah.
I think you're right. I think ensembling, it almost fits well with almost like a lecture lab where some material to kind of become familiar, and then to really like get it in your habits, inside your soul, and inside your fingers, right? It can work well with ensembling. And cool. And I noticed here that you mentioned part of what you're trying to teach is doing TDD outside in. And so I'm having you define more terms, but it's helpful for me because I often get confused. I love TDD, but I often get confused with the different categories of TDD and all that stuff.
Yeah, you're not the only one. Like I remember at one of the Agile Opens, there was a discussion about, do you do outside in, inside out, middle in? And I'm like, I don't know what to call it. The way I develop software, if I'm building something, and I do this, so I do, in addition to the training I do a lot of live coding on Twitch, and so I'm just developing code, and I'm working on, one application is to manage these ensembles. So I've been developing my own system for doing that. And I'm like, okay, I need to add this feature. Where do I start? Well, I need to figure out, what do I need it to look like? Right? What is, it's a small project, but it's the same thing. It's like, what do you want this thing to do? Whether it's a user story or a use case, or you've done story mapping or whatever mapping you're doing, you got to start from, what do you want the thing to do? And it's from the point of view of the outside. Usually, not always, but if it's not, then like, how do it, like, and one of the things I show in my class is like, let's start creating this little class and start TDDing it, which is useful for sort of building some of the basics of TDD. But then I basically say, and this might be a spoiler for people who haven't taken my class yet, it's like, oops, we made a mistake. We created something that does not fit with the thing that it's supposed to fit with, right? We're trying to plug it in and it doesn't fit because How did we know what methods to create, right? And like, what is its interface? What is its API? How do you know until you know what it needs from something else? And so I always think about, I may not literally write code for the outside. So the outside is often the UI, the HTML, or maybe it's an API starting from there, or a message that comes in, wherever it is from the outside. The two questions I always ask as part of TDD is, what do you want it to do? And how do you know it did it?
Mm.
Right. So what do you want it to do? What's the behavior you expect? And what are you going to be able to check, right? Because I'm always thinking from a testing standpoint, is how do you know it did it? Maybe you'll get a response back that you can check, or maybe you have to check some other system, or maybe a test double or an actual database. But how do you know it did it? And so I look at that from the outside, like, okay, I want to be able to recreate a scheduled ensemble because I want it every Friday. Well, what's that going to look like? Well, okay, I'm going to click on a button. Well, where's that button? It's going to be on this page. Once I have that, then I can say, all right, I don't need to create the HTML just yet, but now I know what, okay, it's going to do a post against this endpoint.
Yeah.
And now it's like, okay, I know what the post is. What it's going to contain is this piece of information. Great. Now I can start TDDing that. I can start writing a unit test for that. When I send a post with this content, I expect it's going to do this. And I'm big on refactoring. So I know some people will then say, and then we'll go and figure out the whole trail of components or method calls and then get down to a class. I'm going to write the code right in the controller. But then pretty quickly, it's going to be refactored out into a class. And then that class is going to be pushed into the center until it finally hits adding behavior onto a specific class. And so and this is why, to me, refactoring is such a huge important thing, because you can't develop software that way unless you're refactoring. You will end up with a fat controller that has all the work in it and no domain, and you will suffer the consequences of that.
Yeah. It almost sounds like, correct me if I'm wrong, that I've done different approaches of TDD, but in this outside in style, it's almost like you discover the hexagon as you go, as opposed to predefining it, because you're just getting it to work first, right? And then you're like, oh, well, now that it's working, let's separate some of these concerns, right? Would that be accurate?
Yeah. I sometimes have this visual image of like this puzzle where you drop stuff and you shake it, and eventually stuff lands in the right place. Like you just shake it, and it's like, well, this thing is only domain, and it's about, it references this thing, and you can see it because you start seeing little code smells of like, this is feature envy. This is doing behavior that belongs over there. And so all these things then point it to where it should go. And so you're just constantly sort of looking for little code smells and say, oh, this, and I have a bunch of refactoring maneuvers, one I call cohere method, that solves feature envy. Other people have different names for it, but basically it's like, this belongs here. So, and I have these 3 steps that you follow to move it over there. And now I have to decide, oh, what other tests do I need to write? But yeah, it's sort of like, as you follow the smells and fix them, the code settles into the right place in architecture.
Nice. Yeah. And I think one thing I really like about this approach is that it's very concrete, and it makes it easier to write the test, right? Like, well, if I'm using the system, I would, from the outside, this is what I would expect, and I don't know how I'm going to get there yet, but usually in an ensemble, people can answer those questions like, okay, well, what do we expect? What are we going to do to trigger it, and all those kinds of things. That's great. Yeah. One struggle I've had, and I'm curious your thoughts here. I've noticed a tendency for people to want to stop early, like, hey, it works. Or, hey, we separated one of the 5 concerns, and we're like, it works. Let's move on here. Why do we keep, I think one joke in my current ensemble is, well, at one point in time when I was first ensembling with someone was like, Austin, the amount of refactoring you want to do is ridiculous. And we refer back to that moment a lot and joke around, but like, do you ever get that kind of reaction as you're trying to refactor to something like a hexagon? And how do you deal with that?
It's really hard, because again, it's one of those things that I can tell them all I want, like, this will be better. And it's until what I try to do is look for those moments where See, I told you so, right? Like not like literally I told you so, but I would basically so one of the things I do during the learning ensemble is I'm like pausing. We have a set timer, 5 minutes we've settled on for rotations, but I'm pausing that timer all the time to basically say, all right, hold on, learning moment, teaching moment. We have a discussion. I say, see here, and in fact, we'll go and do things like we'll back up. We'll say, what if we did this first? What if you did this refactoring first? It would make this other thing so easy. In fact, let's do it. And so I can lead them through that because I have the luxury of we don't have a deadline for anything. So I use that opportunity to say, well, let's back up and try this again a different way. And we'll do it. Sometimes we'll back up an entire, a 2-hour session, and next time we'll just repeat it and go a different way to get them, and this is to me, the whole purpose of, a training learning ensemble is that's what it's meant for, is to try out and experience these different things so you can see the impacts of it. And so I can, and so I'm always taking notes of like, oh, this is going to be a good learning opportunity for later. Let's see if anybody notices, and sort of noting these things down. If nobody notices, then I'll say, all right, let's talk about this. And so I can, I will always explain, look, this will be better if we do it this way, and this will be easier. And this is, what I always try to get to is for me, form it in the phrase of, this makes it more testable because. And if I can get to that, then I'm saying, look, if you're interested in testability, that's why we're here. At least that's why I'm here. And this makes it more testable. And sometimes it's obvious and sometimes it's not. And so then I'll push us down that road sometimes, if I can see, a few steps away from that to get them to there. So it's a luxury I have as a learning ensemble, as opposed to getting work done, as we can do that.
Nice. Good. Maybe one question with the hexagon again is so you taught it for a long time in the kind of traditional style, and then you've been teaching it at least for a little while, the ensemble style. What's the big difference you've seen? I think you talked about some things for yourself, like you get to learn too, which is great because I love learning from others' ensembles. What have you seen for the students in the courses?
So that they're going through it, hopefully in an accelerated rate of what I went through learning hexagonal architecture. Because one of the things about hexagonal architecture is, like, you look at Alistair's original write-up, it's not very detailed. It's just, he wrote up a pattern. He didn't, he probably didn't think all that much of it. And there are different sort of interpretations of it because it's not a specification. It's not like a pattern that was written in a book and reviewed and so on. Although there was some discussion on the C2 wiki, but it took me years of a lot of playing with it to finally get to my interpretation of it. And I have some differences from the, what might be the traditional interpretation of it, because I look at it again from how do I develop code and how do I test it. But it took me a while to really figure out precise rules. I like rules. Some people don't like rules. I like rules because they mean I have to think less. And so if I have a rule that says, if this touches hardware, it must not be in this layer, it must be in this other layer, then I can think less. Where does this code go? It touches IO, it goes here, right? It touches the random number generator, therefore it can't be in a domain, it must be in the application layer. And so there's a lot of nuance, and I can't, like in the 14-hour live class, whether it's spread over 2 or 4 days, there's no way they can get that nuance, because they're just learning, like, what the heck is a hexagon? What the heck is an adapter? What are you talking about? And so, like any learning, you can't cram. You can, right? And how well does that work for the long term? Not very well. Right. Yeah, right. It's just enough so you can take the exam and pass, and then you've forgotten it all, right? That's,
you just described my whole high school and college life.
It worked, right? And but it doesn't work in the real world, like a lot of things that we learn in university that don't apply to the real world. And so it's learning is a lot of, one of the things that I learned about learning, and I kind of already intuitively knew that, but now I have evidence to back it up, is, and it may be obvious, but we learn from examples. We learn from examples. We don't learn from abstract and then look at examples and apply it. We build abstractions in our head from seeing lots of examples. right? What's a chair? Well, it's a thing that has four legs. Well, what about a stool? Is that a chair? Well, it has to have a back. Okay, but what if it has three legs, right? All these things, you see enough patterns and you start to create a generalization. Then you can have philosophical arguments about, is this a chair or not? Because it's a beanbag. But and so it's that nuance and seeing constant examples. And so we saw this before, we saw this, let's apply it here. Now we see a different example. It's close to the other one, but it's different. What do we do here? And it's that constant being exposed to differences and edge cases, that's how you really nail down those differences. And so those learning ensembles give me that opportunity to really point out on the fly in the moment what the differences between things.
And so you mentioned earlier kind of refactoring to hexagonal from outside in TDD, and that might be a good launch pad for refactoring in small steps. Yeah, so
yeah, so one of the things that I also have, so I have a community, a Discord community, and one of the things that I started a couple years ago was a book club, because I had been part of various in New York as part of the design pattern study group, where I first learned about design patterns, and then in Silicon Valley, the Silicon Valley design pattern study group, loved it, and we were able to get access to Eric Evans when he was working on the book, things like that. And I thought that well, I want that, right? And so I basically created it. And one of the books we read was Kent Beck's Test-Driven Development by Example. I'm sure I had read it, but there's a difference between sort of reading it on your own and reading it and discussing it and talking about it with others. And I realized I was doing bigger steps. Like one of the things, if you've ever seen anybody like me, starting out teaching TDD, you start with the simple stuff. And it's like, how do we make this test pass, right? It's expecting 8. What do? We return 8. And I used to think that, really, come on, like, we know this is not going to be a literal constant. You're going to have a variable there. You're going to store it in something called balance. But what I learned from reading closely of Kent Beck's book was, sure, we could take larger steps, but I actually find value in the smaller steps because I noticed things that I didn't notice before, like turning that literal and making it more flexible is a refactoring. Extract field. It's like, oh, like I did that, but I never thought about it that way. And so one of the things I see, and again, I see so much in these ensembles, like, wow, you're taking a big step here. Can we make this step smaller?
Yeah.
And the outside in applies here too. The shift to TDD is not just, oh, I need to write a test first and then write code. Is to shift your thinking from what do I want the thing to do without thinking about the implementation. Mm-hmm. We are so trained to think about the implementation while we're thinking about the test we want to write that will test that implementation. I'm like, no, don't think about the implementation. What little thing does it not do yet that you want it to do? Think about that. No, can we make that step smaller? Can we make the expectation smaller? Can we just do something smaller? Because it's like I have this sort of visual in my head of when people are thinking about all the complexities. It's like this graph that just blows up of all these possibilities and if-thens and decision making. And I'm like, you've already thought like 3 levels too deep. Let's just get this little piece solved. And every time I show that, people are like, oh wow, like, yeah, this is so much better. And I love that G. Paul Hill talks a lot about this. It's like, it's faster. Yeah. It's actually faster. Once you get used to it, it's just faster because you're solving smaller problems. And if you mess it up, it's a small mistake that's easily fixed. Yeah. And so the smallness of and I'll be like, no, let's take that even smaller. No, even smaller. And and that kind of feedback you just can't get anywhere else.
Yeah, it's true. I think it's addicting too once you do it, because problems start to become fun instead of stressful, at least in my experience, right?
Oh,
Because when it's
absolutely.
like, hey, something broke in this last commit, and the last commit's 6 files and 1,000 lines, you're like, oh, you know. Where if it's like, oh, something broke in our last commit and it's like 6 lines, you're like, oh, fascinating. I wonder what it is in the 6 lines, you know, or you know,
Or
and
one, or my preference, one line,
or one line, right?
right?
Yeah,
You know,
exactly.
because it's
Yeah.
like that might, you know, it's like, can we fix this? And it's almost, and it's almost a game. Like, what's the least I can get away with? And that's where it becomes, you know, there's this sort of code golf kind of things. It's like, how can you know, I use the word, how can I cheat? And it's not really cheating because the test passes.
Yeah.
And then, you know, how can I cheat now? And you're absolutely right. It makes it so much more fun, and so much less anxiety producing, because you're not like overwhelmed by the problem. You're just like, how do I do this little thing? And how can I
Yeah.
do it in less code?
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Right on. Well, thanks so much for sharing with us today, Ted. We're starting to hit our time box.
Yeah.
So before we close the show, is there anything you'd like to share or plug?
Yeah, so you can find out about my course. So my course is closed so I basically had a launched, and I'm going to relaunch in November. But you can always follow me on Twitter, where I'm JitterTed. My website is ted.dev, so ted.dev. I was very lucky to get that. And so I post articles on this stuff. I have a Discord community where we talk about this stuff. So one of the things that I also found was there's not a lot of places for people who are beyond the novice stage, but are not experts at TDD, but who want to learn about TDD or want to learn about refactoring or design and things like that. And there wasn't really a good place to talk about that. So I basically created my own community for that. So if you go to ted.dev/discord, people are welcome to join the Discord. The book club is free. We basically do Zooms on Sundays to talk about books. We're actually talking about patterns, which I kind of avoided for a while, but we're having people who are interested. It's like, great, let's talk about patterns. That's totally fine. But not just the Gang of Four. Oh God, not just the Gang of Four. There are a few hundred other patterns that are interesting. So we'll be discussing those, and people are welcome to join that as well. So yeah.
Fantastic, fantastic. So to our audience, we'd love to hear your opinions on your experiences with traditional training versus if you've done some learning or ensembles or are interested in that. Your opinions on hexagonal architecture, the different styles of TDD, inside, outside, in. We love your comments on Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube, and more, and all the places. Please reach out to us. We'd love to hear what you think. And please share this episode with anybody who might be interested in maybe hexagons of ensembles of hexagons, or something like that. No, in all seriousness, if anybody's interested in hearing about, a journey to, really learning some of these deep patterns, and they're really beneficial patterns in the software world.
Yeah.
And so, but until next time, have a good one, y'all, and talk to you later. Bye.